Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 96, Part 2, Clancy of the Overflow. If you haven't already, please go back and have a listen to the background to the Clancy of the Overflow poem and also the Clancy link. This episode's going to cover Thomas Michael McNamara. Thomas Michael McNamara's father, Michael, originally had a property called the Overflow, which was on the north side of the Murrumbidgee River in New South Wales. Thomas Michael McNamara was born at the property Gobagandra, near Tumut in New South Wales, on the 24th of December 1848. He was the second born of 15 children. Michael Joseph McNamara had immigrated to Port Jackson on the Java on the 18th of November 1833, and his mother, Ellen Mary Noonan, was 9 years old when she immigrated in 1840 from Limerick Island with her parents and siblings to New South Wales. Michael McNamara and Ellen Noonan married at Dapto, New South Wales, at St Francis Church on the 3rd of November 1847. They already had a child that was born nearly 12 months before their marriage at Gubagandra, near Tumut, on the 18th of December 1846. In Wyalong in 1864, Michael had first settled in a place called the Overflow on the north side of Murrumbidgee River. He then later took up a place called Wyalong, which joined the Bar Medman Run. Gold was discovered and young Thomas worked the gold for a while, and then he opened up a butcher's shop and sold meat to the miners. He went shearing for a time and then took a place on his own called Ellesmere. Thomas McNamara married Teresa Mary Troy in Wagga Wagga, New South Wales on the 25th of November 1875. Teresa Troy was born at Kiamba Creek Station, Bathurst, New South Wales in October 1855, and she was 7 years younger than Thomas. Her father was Nicholas Troy, known as Mick, and he was born in 1800 in Carlo Island. He was convicted at the Carlo Assizes. Nicholas and his brother Thomas were part of a gang who robbed homes. They were capitally convicted and sentenced to be hanged for attacking and firing a house and for threatening to sacrifice the life of Timothy Byrne, the proprietor, if he did not quit a farm recently taken. In the trial on Thursday the 25th of July, 1822, the Chief Baron Lord Norbury, that is John Towler, a Tipperary man, pronounced with tears in his eyes the following sentence: to be hanged on Saturday the 10th of August 1822, Andrew and Armstrong Anderson, Nicholas and Thomas Troy and Christopher Dooley, charging the jury his lordship, paid a high compliment to Reverend Mr Doyle, parish priest of Clonagall, for the admirable line of conduct which he had observed in bringing about the means by which the offenders had been delivered into the hands of justice. Addressing the prisoners, he stated that it was melancholy to reflect that neither youth nor age could protect you. Some of you are too old to have been found in so degrading and a distressing situation. Well, if the parents of the others had done their duty and paid proper attention to their children, some of you ought now to be under chastisement in school instead of standing forward to await the penalty of the law. Sufficient time for preparation will be afforded to each of you, providing you make good use of it. And the reporter in the local paper covered the trial and said, we deem it a duty which we owe our country to hold out to society the moral lesson which these trials must afford. And we should hope that the awful example which the fate of so many of our wretched and guilty countrymen holds forth may operate as an antidote to thousands and call them from their evil pursuits to seek the path of rectitude and peace. It is indeed happy for our country that this knot of robbers has been discovered and brought to justice. Besides the injury which has been done to individuals, the character of the entire neighbourhood has suffered. Yet while we rejoice in the detection of the midnight robbers, we deplore that necessity consigns them to an untimely grave. If there were any other medium by which the ends of justice might be obtained, we should feel more liberty at this moment. But we must at all events, however unpleasant our feelings, continue the melancholy subject until we bring its proper conclusion. The jury gave their verdict of guilty. His Lordship earnestly entreated the prisoners to turn to Almighty God, to attend their clergyman, to implore God to open their hearts and to lay their sins before him. It was his duty to instruct them that they had no hope here, that they should only look to the future, as this world would shortly close upon them forever. However, Nicholas must have been reprieved, as he was transported from England on the 31st of July 1823 and arrived in New South Wales, aged 23, on the Isabella on the 16th of December. His trade at the time of the conviction was a ploughman. Once in Sydney, he was forwarded to Ed's for distribution and then was sent to be in the service of William Warby at Golden Plains as a bullock driver. He received his ticket of leave in July 1833, and he and his brother both received conditional pardons on the 1st of January 1840. Nicholas Troy married Mary McNamara at Tumut on the 16th of February 1843. The marriage was witnessed by his brother Thomas and Mary's sister Anne. Mary McNamara was the daughter of Brian McNamara and Mary Reddy. They married in 1812 at Murrisk, Mayo, Ireland, when Brian was 25 and Mary 19. Brian was convicted of sheep stealing in Mayo in May 1825. The Dublin Morning Register recorded this on the 19th of May. Brian McNamara and 8 others, under sentence of transportation, were conveyed by escort of the First Royals from the jail of Castle Bar on their way to Cork. McNamara has been under the sentence of death, which sentence has since been commuted to transportation for 7 years. His occupation at the time of his conviction was a ploughman and shepherd. He sailed on the Sir Godfrey Webster on the 11th of July 1825, arriving in New South Wales on the 3rd of January 1826, and he was assigned to Thomas Rose at Appin. In 1830, Brian petitioned to Governor Ralph Darling to have his family sent out to the colony at the expense of the government. In 1831, this was approved. On the 6th of August 1833, Mary, aged 40, and the 4 youngest children, Hannah, also known as Honora and Nora, aged 10, Thomas, aged 12, Mary, aged 14, and James, aged 16, arrived at Port Jackson on the ship Caroline. Michael, who was then aged 20, and John, 18, the eldest children, did not travel with their mother to Australia. They arrived as free settlers on the Java, which arrived at Port Jackson on the 18th of November 1833. Presumably, the family, when they arrived, resided with Brian at Mount Gearlead, which was Thomas Rose's property at Appin. In March 1835, along with some other Irishmen, Brian was charged with murdering an English road gang worker on St Patrick's Day when they were drinking at a local inn. An argument erupted with 2 Englishmen over who had the best country. One Englishman ran off and the other was bashed and subsequently died from his injuries. All the Irishmen were found not guilty due to lack of evidence as to who dealt the fatal blow. And then in November 1835 it was recorded in the Supreme Court that John McCarthy stood indicted for stealing from the dwelling house of James Duffy near Campbelltown the goods of property of Abner Brown of Dawes Battery. Brian McNamara was charged as being an accessory. James Duffy recorded that he returned home and found a lock forced from the door. The back door was open, and when he went into the house, he found a chest belonging to Mrs. Brown broken open. I missed a feather bed and bedding with a quantity of other articles. I went to Mr. Bowen's public house and told him of the robbery. I asked where McCarthy was. I suspected him because he knew my house so well. Mr. Bowen said he was not in. We searched the huts for him, but he could not be found. I saw him that night taken into custody. The next morning I found a handkerchief with jewellery, some bed furniture, and I got a warrant and found some of the property at Brian McNamara's. Malachi Daly said that he was at the McNamara's house. When McCarthy came there, it was 4 p.m. McCarthy had a feather bed on his shoulders and he said he bought it at Campbelltown at Patrick's sale. Brian McNamara was in Sydney with my bullock and cart at the time. The things were about to be taken away by McCarthy to sell so he could get a good profit for them. He offered them to Mrs. McNamara cheaper and she bought them for £7. Brian McNamara was in Sydney at the time. Duffy lives about 10 or 11 miles from the McNamaras. Duffy recalled that his house is in the district of Aids and Mrs. McNamara came out free to join her husband about 3 years ago. He said his house was well secured at night, but there was one man's tracks around the house. The jury retired for an hour and a half, in which they returned a verdict of guilty against Brian McNamara and Mary McNamara. His Honour stated that he put the case to the jury to discover whether they would find Brian and Mary McNamara jointly guilty, and it was now his duty to direct them to acquit Mary McNamara. as the jury found them jointly guilty, and she was under the control of her husband, however cognizant of the offence, was not acting under the direction of guilty in the eye of the law, and she was accordingly discharged. Brian McNamara stated in his defence that he was in Sydney when the robberies committed and he could prove the fact. However, Brian was sentenced to 14 years hard labour and sent to Norfolk Island on the Governor Phillip. It was also stated that Mary was acquitted due to the fact that she had to look after the children, with Brian sentenced. Brian petitioned the Governor for a better outcome, and in February 1840 he applied for the remission of his sentence, which he received, and he returned to his family at Appin in March 1840. Brian received a conditional pardon in December 1841, and the family moved to Wagga by 1852. Both Brian and Mary are buried on their property at Cayamba Creek. Neither death is registered, however, but family trees say that Mary died in 1860 and Brian in 1864. So getting back to Nicholas Troy, Nicholas settled on land at Tools Creek at Wagga shortly after his marriage, and it mentions on the 30th of September 1848 that Nicholas Troy had a run called Cayamba Creek, 10,240 acres with an estimated grazing capability of 500 cattle and 1,200 sheep. And on the 31st of December 1859, Nicholas Troy died. He was accidentally killed at the age of 58 when he was driving his cart and it was upset by coming into contact with a sapling. Another article mentioned that he drove against a sapling and upset the cart, and then he fell and the edge of the cart pressed on his neck, killing him. There was a recollection about Nicholas Troy, and it says that he was the father of a large family, a fine type of Irishman, hardly, kind and true, and reckless as a horseman or among wild stock. He usually rode or drove at a furious pace. He was one of the first that I had seen with a spring cart or dray, rare vehicles in that day. We often saw him at the age of about 60 standing in the car with the horse and galloping at full speed. The young Troys were all horsemen and good with wild stock, all-round experts in handling stock of any kind. Thomas was out alone running wild horses in the hills between Tools Creek and Tarcutta and did not return at night. A search party of bushmen was organised early the next morning, and all being expert trackers found and followed the trail of the mob. At the bottom of a steep ravine, they found the body of Troy, the body of his stead with his neck broken. So after Thomas's death, Mary then married Thomas Maloney in April 1862 at Cayamba Creek when she was 37, and she had a further 2 children with him, one surviving infancy, John Edward Maloney. Mary died on Tools Creek Station at Cayamba Creek, Wagga, on the 15th of January 1878 at the age of 53. There was an inquest into her death, which was outlined in the Wagga Wagga Advertiser on the 19th of January 1878. It says an inquest was held at Tools Creek, the residence of Thomas Maloney, on the body of his wife, Mary Maloney, found dead in a well or shaft on the premises. Eliza Burns on oath said, "I reside at Wagga with my brother, Mr. Thomas Burns of the Union Club Hotel. I came out on Friday on a visit. I called on her daughter as I was concerned about her. When her daughter came, I went to the back door away from them. I shifted my position when I heard the daughter cry out, 'Oh God, my mother is down the well.' I looked immediately around and saw the deceased's head disappearing. The well is 100 yards from the house. From the time I came out here to the time she threw herself down the well, the deceased had kept her bed from the continued effects of intemperance. I never saw her actually drinking much, but I know she indulged greatly in drink. I never heard her say anything that might lead me to think that she might destroy herself." Mary Troy on oath said, "I am the daughter of the deceased. My mother has been married to my stepfather for about 16 years. I last saw my mother alive on Tuesday when the witness called me to take my mother away. When my mother heard me approaching, she ran away down the hill. She did not speak or motion to me. She ran to an open shaft that was very deep and situated 100 yards away. It's usually covered with slabs, but my mother could easily approach the shaft. I tried to overtake her but could not. My mother stopped or hesitated, but then went directly to the well. She sat down on the edge. She looked around and saw me approaching and then threw herself in without a word or cry. I gave the alarm and means were used to recover her body but without effect. The body was recovered at 3 o'clock yesterday morning. I do not know why my mother perpetrated the act. She never hinted to me at any time of her intention to commit suicide. The hysterical condition of Mary in court, it was impossible to obtain further answers to questions touching on her mother's habits and condition previous to her death. Patrick Troy, son of Mary, on oath said, "My mother was not intemperate but would occasionally take spirits in excess. She was low-spirited and appeared to have something troubling her mind. My mother and stepfather did not live happily together. However, I do not know the cause of her suicide." And then he was very unwilling to speak of the habits of the deceased and the relations that existed between Maloney and his wife. Dr. Wren gave medical testimony as to the cause of the death, and he said that it resulted by a fall down a well, some 90 feet in depth, thereby occasioning a heavy concussion. And the verdict arrived was the deceased threw herself down a well when in a state of temporary insanity. He married Mary McNamara in Tumut, New South Wales, in February 1843. And on the 30th of September 1848, Nicholas Troy is listed, and it states that his run is Kiamba Creek, with an estimated area of 10,240 acres, with a grazing capability of 500 cattle and 1,200 sheep. Teresa's older brother was James Samuel Troy, known as Jim, and he's thought to have been the subject of the Man from Snowy River. Banjo Paterson had many opportunities to reveal the identity of the Man from Snowy River, but throughout his life he deliberately chose not to, so this is purely a supposition. The McNamara family believed that the events that led to the poem The Man from Snowy River actually began in the area of Wyalong. The Patersons, the McNamaras and the Troys all had neighbouring properties here. Some of the horses got out, including a good colt that was out of mare called Old Regret. Banjo's father, some of the McNamaras and the Troys were all in the group that chased the mob, Jim being on a mountain pony named Mungo, and the rest were on thoroughbreds. Jim caught the mob and brought them back himself, whereas the other horses couldn't follow. Banjo was about 11 years old at the time and away at school in Sydney, so he would have heard all about the story from his father. Earlier, Mick Troy, the father of Jim Troy and Tom McNamara's father-in-law, had a fine stallion called the Glance, and Tom McNamara wanted progeny from it, which he got in a colt he called Clancy. He was so proud of this colt and told everyone in the district, who then in turn christened Tom as Clancy. It is believed that Banjo adjusted the name in the poem to Clancy. In February 1939, there was a recollection from Mr. McNamara, and he was living in Brisbane at the time, and he said, "I well remember the ride as if it took place yesterday," said Mr. McNamara. "From Troy's place near Wagga, you could see the hills in the direction of Tumut. Our adventure was not down Kosciuszko's side, as Paterson sang. Banjo shifted the mountain into our country to make this tale poetic. 3 fine horses broke away from Troy's place, including the 1,000-pound colt from Old Regret, and they joined the wild horses in the hills. The horsemen who rode that day were Tom Troy, my cousin, Andy McNamara, Jim Troy, and myself. When Jim joined us on his little horse Mungo, long-bearded Tom, who sat on yellow Clarence, laughed at Jim and his weedy animal. Then I took Jim's part. As Banjo truly says, only Clancy stood his friend, and I added, I think we ought to let him come. Andy McNamara rode Rowan Clarence, and I had a Lintot horse. We started after the colts, up hills and through Goldstock to them, and ran them as we approached. You can say goodbye to the mob, yelled Tom Troy. But Jim and Mungo went on. Later, Jim had the mob moving towards us. Tom told me to get on the next hill and wheel the mob to the right, but they beat us. Jim stuck to them and ran them, and as the poem says, single-handed till their sides were white with foam. Mrs. McNamara finished the story. She recalled how her brother Jim brought the mob round again and sent a warning coo-wee up the gorge to let the others know he was coming with the mob in full career. Tom, my husband, and Andy at last held the wild horses, cut out the colts and yarded the others. It was grand work, she sighed. He was tired after this task, and Mungo, smothered in foam, rested his big head on the side of a hill. He's all right, said Jim, patting the little fellow fondly. That's the true story of the Man from Snowy River. And Teresa finished by saying, poor Jim, he died when he was only 33 at Cootamundra. So a little on Jim. Jim was married at St Michael's Church in Wagga on the 20th of May 1879 to Elizabeth Sarah Ann Burns of Wagga. But as mentioned, he died in 1884. And the article on the death of James Troy says, "It was with deepest regret we have to record the death of a much respected townsman, the proprietor of the Australian Hotel. On Wednesday night, the sad news of Mr. James Samuel Troy's death spread over the town. The news was the more sad on account of his being in the very prime of his life and having left a young widow and one child. He was of a quiet, kindly disposition and was respected by all who knew him for his straightforward, honest character. The direct cause of death was inflammation of the lungs. He took ill 3 weeks ago but had recovered sufficiently to get about again. On Saturday last he suffered a relapse and was continuing to be worse until 9:10 on Wednesday evening when death claimed him. He was a native of Wagga. He had been 5 years in this district, 2 years as proprietor of the Dingy Dingy Hotel and 3 years proprietor of the Australian Hotel at Cootamundra. He was the younger brother of Mr. Thomas Troy of Green Camps, Stock and Bingle. The funeral was attended by 200 persons, and 30 members of the HACB Society walked in procession wearing their regalia as a last mark of respect to one of their members. So Jim, in fact, had 2 sons. However, one didn't survive infancy, so the remaining child was Augustus James Troy. By February 1888, Thomas Michael McNamara and his wife, Teresa Mary, with 3 young children, Illis Augustine Thomas, born 1882, Lily Camillus, born 1884, and Kate Mary Gertrude, born 1886, made their way north of Bourke towards the Queensland border. They then turned west and arrived at the little town of Yulo, north of the border, where Thomas bought a butcher's shop. In 1890, the town was almost washed away by a flood and it was moved to its present position. Thomas took up a selection of Bow Creek and Paru River and sold the butcher's shop. By 1898, there was a drought and the family had grown to 8 children. On one trip to Bourke, the cattle rushed during a storm, and when Thomas rode to turn them out of the scrub onto the plain, where they could ring around and settle down, he brushed past a dead tree. It caught him across the face and a piece of wood went into his eye, and although he almost pulled most of it out, when he delivered the cattle, he went to Sydney to see a doctor. The doctor got the rest of the wood out, but Thomas lost the eye. At the time of the drought, Thomas began to drink quite a bit. He would go to town, sell a few cattle, load up the wagonette with supplies, put his horses in the stable and feed them, and then get on the grog for a day or so. He was a big man, and at the pub he would lie on the floor and offer £1 if any 3 men could keep him there for 10 seconds. I believe he never lost £1. After these bouts of drinking, he would get very depressed. Coming home from one such bout, he was in a nasty mood and started quarrelling with Teresa, who suggested that he give up the drink and pay more attention to his family. Young Ellis heard the row, and as he came in, he saw Thomas shake his mother by the shoulders and push her across the bed. Thinking that some harm was going to come to her, Ellis picked up a piece of wood from the kitchen and hit his father in the back of the head, sending him to the floor with blood coming from his head. Ellis thought he'd killed his father, so he quickly gathered up some things, rolled a small swag, caught his house and left home. Thomas regained his feet after a short while. Teresa dressed his wounds and all was well. The drought was getting worse and there was no more money for drink anyway. Thomas paid off the scrub cutters that he employed, using money borrowed from the bank, and decided to take the sheep on the road, leaving the rest of the family at home to do what they could for the cattle. In the late 1930s, they moved to Griffith, New South Wales, to live with their second eldest daughter, Mrs. Kate Eskine, and this is where Thomas McNamara died. In the 1939 interview, the reporter described Teresa as tall, graceful and quick-witted, with white hair. The death notice of Thomas McNamara was in the West Wyalong Advocate on the 9th of September 1943. And it says, at the advanced age of 94 years, Mr. Thomas Michael McNamara passed away peacefully in his sleep at the residence of his daughter, Mrs. Erskine, at Griffith on Saturday. When the deceased was about 17 years of age, his father took up Wyalong Station for him, both being there. That was before there was any town of Wyalong. The first discovery of gold at Wyalong was made by a shepherd on the deceased station. The late Mr. McNamara owned one of the prominent mines. Selling out at Wyalong 56 years ago, the deceased went to Queensland, where he acquired Yulo on the Peru, at Cunnamulla on the Warrego, and Thargomindah. Disposing of interests in those parts in 1913, he took up at Mount Tracy Station, Cloncurry. About 4 years ago, he retired, and his wife and him came to Griffith to live with their daughter. He always took a very keen interest in public affairs in whatever district he lived in. He was a Justice of the Peace in the respective districts referred to. Right up to the end, he was mentally alert and followed up the war news with keen interest. All up, there was a family of 13, 8 of which lived to adulthood, and at the time of his death, there were 25 grandsons and 9 granddaughters and 8 grandchildren. In the 1928 interview, Clancy recalled having been in 2 big smashes with horses. In one, he broke a thigh, and in the other, several ribs. But it said that he was still hale and hearty, a long-legged cornstalk of an old colonial school. He loves to talk of horses, cattle, and the droving days. He was a great scrub rider in his time and spoke fondly of the best stock horse he ever owned, Steel, a blue-grey. Although he regretted that horses were passing out of use, he said that he'd enjoyed many motor and aeroplane trips. I cannot see enough in motor cars and still less in aeroplanes. The Cumberland Argus and Fruit Growers Advocate, published in Parramatta, put an article in on the 20th of December 1939 titled Clancy of the Overflow, Banjo Paterson's Immortal pays us a visit. He's 91 on Christmas Eve. Yesterday, an Argus reporter sat on the balcony of the Hotel Prospect talking to Clancy of the Overflow. Made famous nationwide by Banjo Paterson's immortal poem, Thomas Michael McNamara, as he was christened, will be 91 on Christmas Eve. With him was his wife of 64 years, who, before she said yes to this magnificent 6'5" great Australian, was Teresa Mary Troy, sister of Jim Troy. His rugged face is lit up as he retold the famous ride, the theme of the Paterson poem. Teresa added, with a twinkle in her eye, the ride would never have happened if Tom hadn't come courting me. He ran away with me shortly after, she said. During his long and adventurous life, Mr. McNamara had almost every bone in his body broken. 40 years ago, when I was on the night rush with the wild cattle, he lost an eye. In a voice as hearty as that of a young man at his coming-of-age party, he told how many years ago, when he and his brothers-in-law were searching for the bodies of neighbours drowned in a creek, he fished up a carcass of a pig in a sack. When he threw it to his brother-in-law, the pig's hind leg appeared to move. "Holy Mother of God, the creature's alive yet," he shouted. Another adventure that lives in his mind has comedy and tragedy intermixed. It happened at Squirrel Hills in the McKinley Ranges in Queensland 12 years ago when he was 79. When the homestead well became in danger of pollution owing to a wallaby having taken into its head to tumble in, Mr. McNamara promptly descended into the depths to see what he could do about it. Hardly had he done so when cattle in search of water wandered down to the wellhead, and before you could say Jack Robinson, an inquisitive young bull came hurtling down on top of the unfortunate Clancy. His leg was smashed and he managed to climb halfway to the top of the well. How that his 72-year-old wife managed to pull him up the rest of the way on the end of a rope is another epic of the outback that Banjo Paterson might very well sing another song about. How near but yet so far from fortune he was when gold was first found at Wyalong. At the time, Mr. McNamara was the owner of the Wyalong No. 2 station, and the man who had the Midas touch was an old Aboriginal shepherd in his employ. No amount of persuasion could get the old man to divulge the whereabouts of the gold. "I even spent half a sovereign and got him drunk, but he still wouldn't come to it," said Clancy. Then, by a strange twist of fate, came the 3 years of drought between 73 and 75, and Mr. McNamara lost the homestead and everything he possessed. The property was sold, and along came a prospector whose lucky day, all unknown to him, had arrived. Sinking a post hole to where near the long-bleached remains of a wandering bull had been a local landmark for 2 years, he struck it rich, and within only a few yards from where Clancy had vainly delved and dug. In 1932, Mr. and Mrs. McNamara revisited the old homestead at Wyalong. An epic of the outback occurred when Mrs. McNamara was nursing one of her babies and was bitten on the leg by a venomous snake. Lacking a sharp knife, she calmly cut out the affected part with scissors, and a maid sucked the venom from the wound. Teresa then went on to live with their second son, Lewis McNamara, at Mount Tracy Station near Cloncurry, where she died there in August 1948. And an article recounting her death says, "Woman's death recalls poems." Mrs. Teresa McNamara, widow of the man who, according to one school of thought, was Clancy of the Overflow, has died at Cloncurry, aged 93. She was the sister of James Troy, said to be the man from Snowy River. Other authorities firmly accept that the late Thomas Gerald Clancy, Irish-born drover and miner, was the original Clancy of the Overflow. Now to their children. The firstborn, Ellis Augustine Thomas McNamara, was born at Silverest, Barmedman, New South Wales, on the 17th of December 1881. He was taken into Queensland by his parents in February 1888 with his younger sisters, Lily and Kate. They settled at Ullo and then later took up a selection called Cameroo, a few miles above Ullo. Ellis McNamara left home in 1898 due to the incident with his father that was outlined earlier, and he went shearing. He then took a job as head stockman at Davenport Downs on the Diamantina River, which was owned by Cobb & Co. This led him to take on all the droving for Cobb & Co. and on some occasions with Sidney Kidman, who owned several stations in the area. He married Eileen Winifred Hall at Thargomindah, Queensland on the 17th of April 1913, when Ellis was 31 and Eileen 21. They had a team of horses and went on the road from near Thargomindah to Mount Tracy in northwest Queensland, where the family owned property. About 1915, Eileen, with infant Tommy, was pregnant and drove a buggy and 4 horses from the Gulf down to around Cloncurry. Ellis was the drover, and every morning Eileen would cook breakfast for the drovers, tend to the baby, load the buggy and follow Ellis. Ellis would leave early to find the camp for the next site for the night, while the men drove the cattle. Eileen would follow Ellis's horse prints, and he would leave broken branches to tell her where to cross creeks. The loose horses would also follow Eileen in the buggy, and they would travel approximately 7 to 10 miles a day. Eileen was a very strong pioneer woman. Ellis then went on to manage stations and was a horse breaker. They had 6 children all up, 4 who survived childhood. And Ellis's nickname was Roarin' Mac, the name he got from station hands in the Queensland outback. They lived in Charleville, Queensland in 1940. In September 1941, it was mentioned that he was the manager of Prairie Downs, which was a homestead 400 miles from Broken Hill and in southern Queensland. By February 1947, Ellis and Eileen were discouraged by the constant battle with the seasons on the land, and they left the grazing industry and purchased Tombine Hotel, 50 miles south of Quilpie. In 1951 they were living in Manly, and in 1963 living at Wynnum, where Ellis was mining. Ellis died at Toowoomba, Queensland on the 6th of June 1972, aged 90. Thomas and Teresa experienced the death of 3 infants. Edward was the firstborn, and he died at only 1 month old at Burrawa, New South Wales in 1877. Francis Joseph died at the age of 1 in 1881, and Margaret was stillborn at Burrawa in 1882. The next surviving child was Lily Carmillis McNamara, and she was born on the 28th of March 1884 at Silverest, Barmedman, New South Wales. She married John Edward McMahon in 1913 in Queensland. They had 3 children. One son, Edward, died in 1943, aged only 18. Edward Dale McMahon's plane crashed at Yenda during training exercises. He was a trainee of the number 8 EFTS and was critically injured and later died. He was educated at St Patrick's College, Goulburn, and afterwards was on the staff of the Griffith Post Office. He later joined the staff of 2RG in Griffith while awaiting the result of his application for public service. He received the appointment to the staff of the WC&I Commission at Leeton, from which town he enlisted in the Air Force, and he almost completed his elementary course at Narrandera when he met his death. So he had a brother, Frank, that was living in Queensland at the time of his death, and a sister, Mrs. Pollock of Yenda. And Lily died on the 1st of August 1961 in Brisbane. The next child was Kathleen Mary Gertrude, known as Kate. She was born at Barmedman in New South Wales on the 15th of March 1886. She married John Channon Erskine, a Scottish man, at Thargomindah at the property Chess Hunt in 1913. They had 3 children, and she died in Griffith, New South Wales on the 24th of April 1973, aged 87. Michael Patrick Athanasius McNamara was born in Queensland on the 30th of April 1888. He married Gertrude Charlotte Davies in Brisbane in December 1934, when he was 46 and Gertrude 39. He was known as Gallopin' Pat, a nickname he received not long after arriving in Western Australia. He managed Lissadell Station in the East Kimberleys, and it was part of his job to swim a horse across the swollen Ord River to get mail. They still tell the story of Pat, who after crossing the river said, "Those little crocodiles won't hurt you, they're the freshwater crocs. It's the big jokers you have to watch out for." So he managed a range of stations in the Kimberleys, in charge of 60,000 to 70,000 head of cattle, and Pat died in Brisbane in December 1967 at the age of 79. The next child, Violet May McNamara, was born in Queensland on the 24th of July 1889, and she died aged only 24 on the 10th of September 1913 at Toowoomba, Queensland. And it says, Miss Violet McNamara, daughter of Mr. Thomas McNamara of Thargomindah, who was on the eve of getting married, died suddenly from pneumonia this morning. The next child was Lewis Brian McNamara. He was born on the 14th of March 1893 in Queensland. He married Holly Lucas in January 1918 when he was 24 and Holly 18. He was a grazier and owned a property called Kurradale at Mount Tracy. He was described as over 6 foot tall and blonde, and they had 4 children, 3 who survived infancy, and he died in December 1979 at the age of 86. The next child, Owen Rowe McNamara, known as Bungie or the Pope, was born on the 11th of September 1895 in Queensland. He was a grazier in partnership with his brother Louis at Mount Tracy in 1919. He married Alice May Reen in June 1927 at Aramac in Queensland. They had 3 sons. One son, Neville, died aged only 28 in 1958. 4 years prior, he'd been involved in a car crash where he was on a motorbike and collided with a car, and he had a fractured skull and was dangerously ill for some time. Owen worked near McKinley and managed Cuckoo Station, and in 1971 he married Kathleen Murphy a year after Alice's death, and Owen died in June 1978 at Mount Isa, aged 82. And the youngest child in the family, Dorothy Blanche Mary McNamara, known as Doris, was born on the 6th of July 1899 at Cunnamulla in Queensland. She married William Arthur Lucas at Kurradale, Queensland, on the 15th of July 1918. She was 19 and William 29. They had 9 children. William worked as a station hand at Warrenda, near Boulia, Queensland in 1937. However, he died on the 3rd of October 1942 at Julia Creek, near McKinley. He was aged only 52, and their twin boys had only just been born in the June. Robin, one of the twin boys, died on the 20th of September, a little over 2 weeks before William died. So this would have been an awful time for Dorothy. In 1972, Dorothy was living at the property Squirrel Hills, near McKinley, with her children, and Dorothy died in Townsville in June 1990, aged 90. And you would have noticed that the McNamara family are certainly blessed with good genes. A vast majority of the descendants certainly lived well into their 80s and early 90s, which in that time was quite a feat.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.